In the vast, frozen expanse of Russia, winter is not just a season. It is a force that shapes every aspect of life, every thought, every action. It is a presence that dominates the land for months at a time, stretching across forests, plains, and rivers, laying claim to the world with a quiet, relentless authority. The cold in Russia is not like the occasional frost or a few days of snow elsewhere in the world. It is an omnipresent, inescapable reality. It seeps into the soil, freezes the rivers into vast sheets of ice, and coats the forests in layers of frost so thick that even the oldest trees groan beneath its weight. Temperatures can drop well below -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind, a piercing, merciless force, scours the open plains, carrying the scent of ice and snow, cutting through clothing, walls, and skin alike. To live in such an environment requires more than courage. It demands ingenuity, patience, and an intimate understanding of nature's brutal rhythms. For the families who lived in rural Russia, winter was a test of endurance, a trial of human resilience that arrived each year with predictable regularity. The snow could start as early as October and linger well into April, blanketing the landscape in an unbroken, silent white. The sun, when it appeared, hovered low on the horizon, casting long, pale shadows across the frozen fields. In these months, the days felt shorter, and the nights stretched endlessly. Life slowed to match the rhythm of the land, and survival became a careful balance of preparation, resourcefulness, and adaptation. Every decision mattered, every log chosen for the home, every piece of food stored away, every layer of clothing worn inside a cabin that might be the only barrier between life and death. Amid this relentless winter, the Russian log cabin emerged as more than just a dwelling. It became a sanctuary. These humble structures, often overlooked by modern observers, were marvels of practical design, a fusion of architectural ingenuity and intimate knowledge of the natural world. They were constructed not merely to house families, but to shield them from an environment that would be fatal to the unprepared. Each log, thick and heavy, was carefully selected, stripped of its bark, and fitted together with meticulous precision. Moss, straw, or clay was packed between the logs to create insulation so effective that inside the cabin, life could continue even as the world outside froze into silence. The cabin was a fortress, a carefully controlled environment where warmth, safety, and sustenance could be maintained despite the bitter winds that screamed across the plains and forests. The process of building a log cabin was itself a reflection of the challenges posed by the Russian winter. It required knowledge passed down through generations, an understanding of which trees could endure frost, how to interlock logs to prevent drafts, and how to design a roof steep enough to shed heavy snow but stable enough to withstand storms. The cabins were usually small and compact, a deliberate choice to conserve heat. Larger homes might have seemed comfortable in theory, but in a world where heating came from a single stove, every extra foot of space was a liability. Inside, the family could huddle together, sharing warmth, while outside, the wind cut across the land with no consideration for the lives it threatened. The environment itself was both a challenge and a teacher. In the forests surrounding the villages, trees groaned under layers of ice, their branches heavy with snow, forming natural barriers that shielded cabins from the worst of the wind. Rivers, once free, flowing in the summer months, became highways of ice, their surfaces so solid that they could support the weight of sleds and people. Wildlife, from foxes to wolves, adapted to the frozen landscape, finding food in the harshest conditions and teaching humans lessons in survival. The families learned to watch the skies, read the clouds, and understand the subtle changes in wind and temperature that signaled approaching storms. Every winter was a reminder that life depended on respect for nature, a careful observation of its patterns, and a willingness to adapt. Inside the cabins, life moved at a different pace. The cold outside shaped every activity, dictating routines and habits that might seem foreign to those accustomed to milder climates. Wood had to be chopped and stored in advance. The stove had to be fed continuously to maintain warmth. Food, often preserved through drying, salting, or smoking, had to be carefully rationed. Each meal a deliberate calculation to ensure survival through weeks when fresh supplies were unavailable. Clothing, layered and insulated, was vital. Even brief exposure to the outside world could be dangerous, and frostbite was a constant threat. The cabin, in this context, was not just a home, it was the center of life, the only place where warmth, nourishment, and safety could be guaranteed. The architecture of the Russian log cabin itself tells a story of human ingenuity confronting environmental extremes. The logs, often hand-hewn, were stacked horizontally, their ends interlocked to create walls of remarkable strength. The thickness of the logs served as natural insulation, while the chinking between them, moss, clay, or straw, sealed the gaps against wind and moisture. Windows were small, minimizing heat loss, and often covered with shutters or cloth during the coldest months. Roofs were steeply pitched to prevent the accumulation of snow, which could otherwise collapse under its own weight. And at the center of every cabin stood the stove, a massive masonry structure that was both hearth and heart, radiating warmth and sustaining life. The stove, known as the Pechka, was central to survival. It provided heat, of course, but it was more than a source of warmth. It was a lifeline. Its design allowed for slow, steady heating, retaining warmth for hours or even days. Families cooked their meals on its surface, baked bread in its oven, and even slept atop its heated platforms to escape the chill of the floor. In the dead of winter, when the wind howled like a living thing across the frozen fields, the Pechka was a haven, a place where families could gather, share stories, and feel the steady pulse of life amid the harshness of the world outside. But survival was not only about structures or stoves. It was about community, knowledge, and resilience. Villagers relied on each other for resources, information, and protection. Skills were passed down from generation to generation: how to build a cabin, how to prepare for winter, how to move across ice and snow without falling prey to frost or hidden hazards. Children learned from an early age to respect the cold, to dress appropriately, and to understand the rhythms of the seasons. Every winter was both a challenge and a lesson, a test of human endurance and ingenuity. The psychological impact of winter cannot be underestimated. The long nights, the unbroken snow, the isolation, these were factors that shaped not only daily life, but the human spirit. Families had to find ways to maintain hope, warmth, and mental resilience when the world outside seemed frozen and lifeless. Storytelling, singing, and communal activities became vital, as did the rituals surrounding food, fire, and care for one another. The log cabin, in this sense, was more than wood and stone. It was a vessel of human spirit, a container for life, laughter, and hope amidst the deadliest months of the year. In examining these cabins today, we gain insight not only into architectural ingenuity, but into the lives of those who built them. They reveal a world where survival depended on deep knowledge of the land, a profound respect for nature, and an unshakable commitment to family and community. The Russian log cabin was more than a shelter. It was a blueprint for enduring the extreme, a testament to the human capacity for adaptation and resilience. Its design reflects centuries of experience, observation, and trial, and error in an environment where failure could mean death. As the snow fell each year, as the winds howled across the frozen plains, the cabin stood firm, Their walls held warmth where the world outside offered none. Their stoves radiated life where frost and darkness threatened to dominate. And inside, families lived, laughed, and survived, carrying forward traditions and knowledge that would sustain generations. The story of these log cabins is a story of survival, ingenuity, and the intimate relationship between humans and the environment, a relationship that demands respect, patience, and understanding. The harsh Russian winter may have been merciless, but it also fostered one of the most practical and enduring examples of human adaptation. Through storms, deep snow, and nights that seemed to stretch endlessly, the log cabins of Russia were not only homes. They were sanctuaries, fortresses, and symbols of the unbreakable human spirit. And as we look back today, in the warmth and safety of modern homes, it is easy to underestimate the brilliance of these structures and the quiet courage of the families who relied on them to endure the deadliest winters the earth has to offer. Even now, the Izba stands as a monument to survival, a reminder that in the coldest and harshest of places, humanity found a way to thrive. It is a lesson in preparation, ingenuity, and resilience, a legacy of warmth and protection in a world that can be unrelentingly cold. The story of how Russian log cabins kept families alive is, in the end, a story of life itself, stubborn, inventive, and unyielding in the face of nature's most formidable trials. The Russian log cabin, or Izba, is more than just a structure of wood. It is a testament to centuries of adaptation, ingenuity, and survival in one of the harshest climates on Earth. To understand its importance, we must first look deeply into the environment and historical circumstances that made it not merely a choice, but a necessity for survival. For generations, families across the vast expanses of Russia relied on these humble yet resilient homes to endure the relentless winters that could stretch for half the year, sometimes longer. It was a land where the frost did not merely chill it penetrated, it demanded respect, and it tested the very limits of human endurance. In these conditions, architecture was not a matter of aesthetics or comfort. It was life or death. The Izba emerged as the perfect response, honed by experience, necessity, and a profound understanding of the natural world. The roots of the Russian log cabin can be traced back to the earliest settlements in the dense forests of northern and central Russia. The abundance of trees provided both the materials and the inspiration for these homes. Unlike regions where stone or clay was plentiful, the vast boreal forests of Russia offered timber in almost limitless supply. Pines, spruces, firs, and larches were carefully selected, cut, and shaped into logs suitable for building. These forests were not merely backdrops for human life. They were partners in survival, supplying the essential resources for warmth, shelter, and sustenance. Every aspect of the cabin reflected an intimate knowledge of the trees themselves, which species would endure the freeze, which logs would resist warping, and how the natural oils in the wood could help repel moisture and pests. The design of the Izba evolved over centuries, shaped by the lessons of countless winters. In early rural settlements, people experimented with different construction methods, learning what worked and what did not. Horizontal log stacking became the standard, as it provided strength, stability, and the capacity to trap heat. The interlocking of logs at the corners, sometimes with complex notches carved to prevent gaps, was more than an architectural flourish. It was a precise technique developed to resist the penetration of icy winds. Builders learned that the thickness of the logs mattered. Too thin, and the cold would seep through. Too thick, and the construction became unwieldy and inefficient. Over time, The balance was perfected, resulting in walls that could endure the harshest blizzards and maintain a livable interior temperature. Insulation was another critical factor in the success of these cabins. The gaps between logs were never left empty. Instead, they were carefully packed with moss, clay, or straw. These natural materials acted as a barrier, preventing heat from escaping and cold air from entering. Moss, with its soft, fibrous structure, was particularly effective. It expanded slightly when damp, sealing even the smallest cracks. Clay and straw provided additional structural support, filling gaps and preventing drafts. This attention to detail meant that even when the temperature outside plummeted, the interior of the cabin remained surprisingly warm. The people of rural Russia understood that the home itself had to be an active participant in survival, a living mechanism designed to preserve life. Windows in the Izba were small and strategically placed. Unlike modern homes, where large panes are prized for light and view, these cabins prioritized heat retention. Each window was carefully sealed, sometimes with additional layers of cloth or wooden shutters during the coldest months. The idea was simple: minimize any points where warmth could escape. Roofs were steeply pitched to allow snow to slide off naturally, preventing the accumulation that could collapse the structure under its weight. Roofs were often thatched or covered with wooden shingles, materials chosen for their durability and insulating properties. Even the placement of the cabin on the land was deliberate. Builders considered the direction of prevailing winds, the sun's path, and the surrounding terrain to maximize protection and warmth. Life in the Izba was shaped as much by the cabin as by the landscape itself. The interior was designed for efficiency and practicality, with every feature serving multiple purposes. A single masonry stove often dominated the central space, providing heat for cooking, drying clothes, and even sleeping on its warm surfaces. Furniture was minimal, designed to conserve space and retain warmth. Beds and benches were often elevated, allowing heat from the stove to circulate beneath them. Storage was carefully organized to ensure that essential items, especially food and firewood, were readily accessible during the long months when venturing outside could be dangerous. In these cabins, the concept of home extended beyond comfort. It was a carefully orchestrated system of survival. The stove, or Pechka, deserves particular attention, as it was arguably the most important feature of the Izba. Constructed from bricks or stone, it was massive, capable of holding and radiating heat for hours. Its design allowed families to cook meals on its surface, while the interior chambers retained warmth. In some cabins, the stove's extended flat surfaces served as sleeping platforms, ensuring that even in the coldest nights, family members could remain safe and warm. The stove's importance cannot be overstated. It was literally the heart of the home, the central axis around which survival revolved. Frostbite and hypothermia were constant threats, and without the steady, radiating warmth of the Pechka, many families would have perished during the harshest months of winter. Beyond the physical construction, the Izba was deeply intertwined with culture and community. Building a cabin was often a communal effort, with neighbors assisting each other in raising walls, roofing, and sealing gaps. Knowledge of construction, insulation, and maintenance was passed down orally and through demonstration, creating a living tradition of survival wisdom. Families relied on this knowledge not just for comfort, but for life itself. Children grew up observing and participating in the work, learning the subtleties of cutting logs, packing insulation, and tending the stove. This knowledge was not theoretical, it was the difference between life and death. The cabin, therefore, was both a physical structure and a repository of collective experience, a living testament to human ingenuity in the face of environmental extremity. The challenges of winter extended beyond architecture and design. Food security was a constant concern, and the cabin played a crucial role in storage and preservation. Root vegetables, grains, salted meats, and smoked fish were common staples, carefully stored to last through months when hunting or farming was impossible. The design of the storage spaces within the cabin often took into account insulation and protection from pests. Even the positioning of the food relative to the stove was calculated to maintain freshness and prevent spoilage. The Izba, in this sense, was more than a shelter. It was a carefully controlled ecosystem, balancing heat, ventilation, and storage to sustain life. Psychologically, the cabin provided stability and reassurance in a world defined by harshness and unpredictability. Long, dark nights and endless snow could be oppressive, and the cabin offered a sanctuary from both the elements and the isolation. Families gathered around the stove, sharing stories, songs, and traditions that reinforced bonds and morale. The walls themselves, built from living trees, seemed to carry the presence of previous generations, connecting the occupants to their heritage and history. In a landscape where the environment was often indifferent to human existence, the Izba represented not only survival but identity, continuity, and cultural resilience. The evolution of the Russian log cabin also reflects adaptation to regional variations in climate and resources. In northern regions, where winters were longer and more severe, cabins were smaller and more heavily insulated. In areas closer to rivers or lakes, builders considered humidity and frost penetration in their choice of logs and foundation design. In the southern reaches, where winters were milder but still harsh, cabins were larger, with more elaborate interiors and slightly larger windows. Across the vastness of Russia, the Izba remained a common thread, a unifying symbol of human adaptation to one of the world's most challenging environments. Its design was not static. It evolved in response to the needs of the families it sheltered, reflecting centuries of accumulated wisdom and experimentation. Even the very act of living in an Izba required adaptation. Families learned to move efficiently within the confined space, conserving heat and energy. Clothing inside the cabin was layered but less cumbersome, as the warmth from the stove made heavy outer garments unnecessary indoors. Tasks like cooking, mending clothes, and childcare were all adapted to the spatial and thermal constraints of the home. Every action was a calculated part of a larger system, designed to ensure that the family could endure months of isolation and extreme cold. The log cabin was not merely a backdrop to life. It was a framework within which life was organized, a system that integrated architecture, environment, and human behavior into a coherent model of survival. In reflecting on the Russian log cabin, it becomes clear that its significance extends far beyond the practical. It represents a profound interaction between humans and their environment, a model of resilience and ingenuity in the face of overwhelming natural challenges. The cabin embodies principles that are both timeless and universal: the careful observation of the natural world, the deliberate use of available resources, the integration of knowledge across generations, and the importance of community in sustaining life. It is an enduring symbol of human adaptability, creativity, and perseverance, a reminder that even in the harshest climates, people have found ways not only to survive but to thrive. The Russian log cabin, therefore, is not simply a historical artifact or a quaint image of rural life. It is a living testament to the intelligence, skill, and determination of countless generations who faced winters that would have defeated less prepared societies. It is a structure that illustrates the seamless blending of culture, environment, and survival strategy, a home that embodies both practicality and ingenuity. By studying the Izba, we gain insight into a way of life that demanded constant attention to detail, careful planning, and profound respect for the natural world. Its legacy is not confined to history books. It continues to inspire an understanding of resilience and adaptation that is relevant even today. The story of the Russian log cabin is ultimately a story of human perseverance. It is about families who, despite being surrounded by an indifferent and often hostile environment, created warmth, security, and continuity. It is about the careful selection of trees, the meticulous stacking of logs, the packing of moss and clay, the strategic placement of a stove, and the communal knowledge that made survival possible. It is about life lived in harmony with the land, in awareness of the forces that could end life in a single night. The Izba is more than a structure. It is a manifestation of human determination, an emblem of the ingenuity that allows people to endure when nature offers no concessions. The construction of the Russian log cabin, or Izba, was never a casual undertaking. It was a process honed over centuries, a combination of necessity, ingenuity, and deep understanding of the natural environment. In a land where winters could freeze rivers, crush crops, and threaten life itself, a cabin was more than a dwelling. It was the difference between survival and tragedy. From the moment a family selected a site for their home, every step of construction was guided by an awareness of the harsh conditions that would define their lives. The forests that stretched across Russia were not merely resources. They were partners, providing the timber, knowledge, and inspiration necessary to build a structure that could endure months of ice, snow, and wind. The choice of wood was the first and perhaps most critical decision. The builders of Izbas understood that not all trees were created equal, and some species were uniquely suited to withstand the extreme cold. Pines, spruces, and firs were often favored for their straight trunks, strength, and resistance to moisture and decay. Larches, with their natural oils, could resist rot even in damp conditions, making them ideal for foundations and structural supports. The selection of each log was a careful balance between size, quality, and durability. The logs had to be large enough to provide insulation, but manageable enough to be handled with the tools available, often simple hand axes and saws. Every tree was felled with an awareness of how its wood would behave over time, how it would shrink, expand, or settle in the winter cold. Once the trees were chosen and cut, the process of shaping and preparing the logs began. Bark was stripped away, and logs were sometimes hewn to achieve a flatter surface for better stacking and stability. This was painstaking labor, often performed by the entire family or with the assistance of neighbors, because time was a precious commodity in regions with short summers and long winters. The logs were then transported to the building site, often over uneven terrain, frozen rivers, or snow-covered plains. Moving a heavy log through the Russian wilderness was an arduous task, requiring ingenuity as well as physical strength. Teams of oxen, sleds, and simple block and tackle systems were used, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of mechanics and leverage long before modern technology. The stacking of logs was itself a precise and deliberate process. Horizontal construction became the standard because it provided stability and allowed for the natural insulation properties of the wood to be maximized. Each log was carefully notched at the ends to interlock with adjacent logs, a technique that created a tight, durable corner. The craftsmanship was remarkable. The notches were cut with precision, ensuring that the logs would fit snugly together, resisting both wind and movement. This technique was developed over generations, through trial, error, and observation. As builders learned which methods could withstand the heaviest snow, the strongest gusts, and the gradual settling that occurs as wood dries and contracts. The gaps between the logs, inevitable even with precise notching, were not left to chance. These spaces were carefully filled with insulating materials, moss, straw, or clay. Moss, abundant in the Russian forests, was particularly prized for its resilience. When packed between logs, it expanded slightly as it absorbed moisture, sealing cracks and blocking drafts. Straw provided a fibrous barrier, while clay added structural rigidity and additional insulation. This chinking process was labor-intensive, but it was essential. Without it, the cold would infiltrate the cabin, making life inside almost unbearable during the dead of winter. The attention to detail in this process reflects a profound understanding of thermodynamics long before it was formally studied. Builders instinctively knew how heat moved, how cold penetrated, and how to maximize the natural insulating properties of the materials available to them. Foundations were another critical aspect of construction. In a land where frost could heave soil and damage structures, the foundation had to be carefully prepared. Stones were often laid at the base of the cabin to provide stability and prevent moisture from seeping into the wood. In some regions, logs themselves were used as a base, raised slightly above the ground to avoid direct contact with soil, which could lead to rot. This elevated design also helped prevent snow from accumulating against the walls, reducing moisture infiltration. The choice of foundation was not uniform. It varied according to local conditions, soil type, and available materials. But in every case, it reflected a careful calculation aimed at long-term durability and protection against the harsh winter environment. The roof of the Izba was equally important. Steeply pitched, it was designed to shed heavy snow naturally, preventing the accumulation that could collapse a less sturdy structure. Roofs were often covered with wooden shingles or thatch, chosen for their insulating properties and availability. In some cases, multiple layers were used to maximize protection from wind and precipitation. The overhang of the roof was calculated to shield the walls and entrance from both rain and snow, ensuring that the cabin remained as dry as possible inside. In this way, the roof was not merely a cover. It was an active component in the overall thermal and structural system of the home. Windows and doors were deliberately small and tightly fitted. Large openings were avoided because they would allow precious heat to escape. Shutters and cloth coverings were often added during the coldest months to further reduce heat loss. The placement of these openings was strategic. Windows were positioned to capture maximum sunlight during the brief winter days, while doors were oriented to minimize exposure to prevailing winds. Even the spacing and alignment of logs around these openings required skillful craftsmanship, as any misalignment could compromise the cabin's insulation. Every detail of the construction was informed by an intimate understanding of the environment, a practical knowledge accumulated through generations of observation and experimentation. Inside the cabin, the layout was designed to maximize the use of heat and space. The stove, often located in the center, radiated warmth throughout the home. Sleeping areas were positioned to benefit from the heat, and storage spaces were arranged to protect food and supplies from freezing temperatures. Furniture was functional and compact, minimizing obstructions to airflow and conserving heat. Even the arrangement of family members in the space reflected practical considerations. Everyone contributed to maintaining warmth, and communal living reinforced social bonds while ensuring survival. In this sense, the construction of the Izba was not just about the physical shell. It was about creating an environment that supported life, activity, and human interaction under extreme conditions. The construction process itself was often a communal effort, reflecting the interconnectedness of rural Russian life. Neighbors would assist one another in raising walls, lifting heavy logs, and roofing the structure. Skills were shared, advice exchanged, and techniques demonstrated, creating a culture of collaboration and mutual support. This communal approach was not merely social, it was practical. Building a cabin in a short summer season required manpower, coordination, and efficiency. The knowledge required to construct a durable, insulated, and functional Izba was extensive, and passing it on ensured that future generations could continue to thrive in a challenging environment. Seasonal timing was also critical. Construction had to be completed before the onset of winter, as the arrival of snow could make transport and assembly impossible. This required careful planning, organization of labor, and preparation of materials. Families often began work in late spring or early summer, cutting and seasoning logs, gathering insulating materials, and preparing foundations. By late autumn, the cabin had to be weatherproof, with the stove installed and functional, doors and windows sealed, and storage areas stocked for the coming months. The timing and coordination required reflected an understanding not only of construction techniques, but also of the rhythms of the natural world, a precise orchestration that balanced human activity with environmental constraints. Even the smallest details mattered: the type of wood used for the stove's chimney, the angle of the roof rafters, the method of tying moss between logs. Each decision had practical consequences for insulation, durability, and safety. Builders understood that small errors could compromise the cabin's integrity, allowing cold to penetrate or moisture to seep in. The meticulous attention to detail in every aspect of construction speaks to the practical intelligence and adaptive ingenuity of these communities. They were not merely constructing homes, they were engineering survival. Over time, the techniques of building an Izba were refined and passed down, creating a living tradition of architectural knowledge. Oral instruction, apprenticeship, and hands-on experience ensured that each generation could improve upon the previous one, adapting to changes in climate, available resources, or new insights gained from observation. This cumulative wisdom is evident in the enduring nature of these cabins. Many examples still stand today, centuries after they were built, a testament to the effectiveness and resilience of their construction methods. The Russian log cabin, therefore, represents more than a historical curiosity. It embodies the practical application of knowledge, resourcefulness, and ingenuity in a context of extreme environmental challenge. Every log, every notch, every layer of insulation reflects a deep understanding of the forces of nature and the requirements of human survival. It is a structure designed not for luxury or convenience, but for endurance, resilience, and life itself. In examining these construction techniques, we also gain insight into the broader cultural and social context of rural Russian life. The building of a home was an expression of human adaptation, cooperation, and foresight. It illustrates how people responded to environmental pressures, not with despair, but with creativity, skill, and determination. The Izba was a physical manifestation of a philosophy that survival required careful planning, knowledge of the natural world, and the integration of human ingenuity with available resources. Through the meticulous construction of walls, the strategic placement of windows, the crafting of roofs, and the installation of stoves, families created a controlled, life-sustaining environment within an otherwise hostile landscape. Each cabin was a miniature ecosystem designed to regulate temperature, conserve resources, and protect life. It was a triumph of practical intelligence, a synthesis of observation, experience, and skill honed over generations. Even today, when modern heating, insulation, and construction materials dominate, The Izba stands as a remarkable example of human adaptation. Its design principles, efficient use of materials, attention to insulation, centralization of heat, and strategic layout, remain relevant in understanding how architecture can respond to environmental extremes. The Russian log cabin is not simply a relic of the past, it is a testament to enduring human wisdom, a model of resilience, and a reminder that survival often depends on the careful integration of knowledge, skill, and environment. Through the centuries, the construction of the Izba became more than a technical process. It became a cultural practice, a tradition that linked generations. Children learned not only to build but to understand the land, to respect the forests, to anticipate the coming winter, and to value the labor and knowledge required to create a home capable of protecting life. In this way, the Izba represents both an architectural achievement and a living educational system, transmitting essential survival skills through hands-on experience and shared knowledge. The ingenuity and meticulous care invested in building these log cabins underscore a timeless truth. In harsh environments, survival is inseparable from design. The Izba exemplifies how human beings can harmonize with the natural world, using available resources wisely, observing environmental patterns, and crafting solutions tailored to specific challenges. The logs, moss, clay, and stone were not merely materials. They were tools in a sophisticated system of adaptation, carefully assembled to protect life against the extremes of winter. At the heart of every Russian log cabin, or Izba, there existed an object of unparalleled importance, the stove known as the Pechka. It was more than a simple cooking apparatus. It was the lifeblood of the home, the core around which the rhythms of survival revolved. In the harsh winters of rural Russia, when temperatures could plunge to unimaginable lows and winds cut across the open plains like blades, the Pechka was the difference between life and death. It provided warmth, nourishment, and comfort, sustaining the family not only physically but psychologically. The stove's presence defined the very essence of domestic life, shaping routines, habits, and even the architecture of the cabin itself. It was both a practical necessity and a cultural icon, a symbol of human ingenuity confronting one of nature's most unforgiving climates. The design of the Pechka was remarkably sophisticated for its time. Constructed from bricks, clay, and stone, the stove was built to retain and radiate heat for extended periods, even after the fire had burned down. Its large, heavy masonry acted as a thermal battery, absorbing energy from the fire and releasing it gradually into the surrounding space. This was essential in a climate where the nights were long and bitter, where a fire that burned out too quickly could mean frostbite, illness, or worse. Families understood instinctively that the stove had to be built with care, its size, shape, and materials calculated to maximize heat retention while providing sufficient surface area for cooking and other domestic tasks. The Pechka's structure often dominated the center of the cabin, its sheer mass a testament to its critical role in sustaining life. Functionality was at the heart of the stove's design. Unlike modern stoves, which separate cooking and heating, the Pechka served multiple roles simultaneously. Its upper surfaces acted as a platform for cooking meals. Porridge, bread, soups, and stews simmered in heavy pots that were placed directly on or near its heated surfaces. Its interior chambers could be used to bake bread, roast meat, or dry herbs and vegetables, preserving food for the long winter months. Even the stove's outer surfaces were sometimes utilized for sleeping. The warmth radiating from the masonry created a heated platform that could keep a family member safe from the biting chill of the cabin floor. In this way, the stove was not merely a tool. It was the heart of domestic life, integrating warmth, nourishment, and comfort into a single, indispensable structure. The stove's importance extended far beyond the purely physical. In a land where winter darkness could be oppressive and the isolation of rural life profound, the Pechka provided a psychological anchor. Families would gather around it, drawn by its heat, its light, and its promise of safety. It was a place for storytelling, for sharing meals, for planning the day's tasks, and for fostering the bonds that enabled survival in harsh conditions. Children grew up understanding that the stove was central to their lives, and adults respected it not only as a practical necessity, but as a living presence that demanded care and attention. The act of feeding the fire, tending the coals, and maintaining the structure became a ritual, an ongoing conversation with the natural forces outside the cabin. Construction of the Pechka required a deep understanding of materials and physics. Bricks or stones were arranged to create a series of chambers and flues that controlled the flow of heat and smoke. The stove had to burn efficiently, channeling smoke out of the cabin through a chimney while keeping as much heat as possible inside. Poorly constructed stoves could waste fuel, release smoke into the living space, or fail to provide sufficient warmth, with dire consequences during the deadliest weeks of winter. Skilled masons understood the precise balance between airflow, fuel consumption, and heat retention, often adjusting designs based on the size of the cabin, the number of occupants, and the local climate. The construction process itself could take days or weeks, requiring careful planning, patience, and expertise passed down through generations. Fuel efficiency was another critical consideration. In a world where firewood had to be gathered, chopped, and stored in advance of winter, waste was not an option. The Pechka was designed to maximize the heat extracted from each log, with the fire's energy radiating both directly into the room and into the stove's thermal mass. The careful placement of grates, chambers, and vents allowed for complete combustion of wood, reducing the amount needed while providing consistent warmth. Families would often gather wood throughout the summer and fall, carefully selecting and drying logs to ensure optimal burning. The stove was thus intimately connected to the broader practices of preparation and resource management that defined life in rural Russia. Beyond its technical aspects, the stove also shaped the very layout and design of the cabin. Because the Pechka was so central to survival, the interior of the Izba was organized around it. Beds, benches, and storage areas were positioned to maximize the distribution of heat, while doorways and windows were placed to minimize drafts. Cooking and food preparation occurred near the stove, while sleeping platforms were often elevated to capture the warmth that naturally rose. Even the rhythm of daily life, waking, working, eating, and resting, was dictated by the stove's influence, as families coordinated their activities around its cycles of heating and cooling. In this way, the stove was not just an object, it was the organizing principle of domestic space, shaping how life was lived in the frozen north. The cultural significance of the Pechka extended beyond its practical uses. In many communities, it became a symbol of family, stability, and resilience. Its presence was a mark of security, a statement that the household was prepared to face the harsh winter months. Stories, songs, and folklore often featured the stove, reflecting its centrality in daily life and its role as a witness to the joys, struggles, and hardships of rural existence. In some cases, elaborate carvings or decorative brickwork adorned the stove, transforming it into a work of art as well as a functional necessity. The Pechka thus occupied both material and symbolic space, embodying the intersection of survival, culture, and human creativity. The stove's role in food preservation cannot be overstated. In a climate where farming was impossible during long winters, stored food had to last for months without spoiling. The stove's residual heat provided an ideal environment for drying vegetables, fruits, herbs, and even meat. Pots of broth or porridge could be kept warm throughout the day, while baked goods retained freshness longer than they would in a cold room. In this way, the Pechka extended the family's ability to survive, turning limited resources into a sustained, life-giving supply. Every aspect of its use was carefully considered, reflecting a profound understanding of the interplay between heat, moisture, and preservation. The stove also played a central role in hygiene and domestic chores. Clothes, bedding, and even shoes could be dried and warmed, preventing the accumulation of dampness that could lead to illness. During harsh winters, when outdoor activity was limited, the stove became a hub for household maintenance, allowing families to carry out essential tasks in a safe, controlled environment. Its warmth made it possible to continue daily routines despite the inhospitable conditions outside, reinforcing its centrality to life in the cabin. Socially, the stove was a gathering place. Families would huddle around it during the long nights, sharing stories, games, and songs that strengthened bonds and provided emotional support. The presence of warmth created a sense of safety, allowing children to play and adults to converse without fear of exposure to the cold. Meals were eaten here, plans were made, and traditions were passed down. The stove became a focal point for intergenerational interaction, reinforcing the social structures that were essential for survival in isolated rural communities. Maintaining the stove was a constant task, reflecting the ongoing relationship between humans and their environment. Ashes had to be cleared, fires tended, and repairs made as needed. Neglect could result in loss of heat, smoke entering the cabin, or even structural damage. Families learned to recognize subtle signs of inefficiency or wear, adapting their techniques and schedules accordingly. The act of caring for the stove was thus both practical and symbolic, representing vigilance, responsibility, and the ongoing negotiation between human ingenuity and the forces of nature. Even in the deepest, darkest weeks of winter, when blizzards raged outside and frost coated every surface, the Pechka remained a source of life and continuity. Its warmth allowed families to endure isolation, scarcity, and the physical hardships of sub-zero temperatures. Children grew accustomed to sleeping near its heated surfaces, while adults relied on its steady radiance for comfort, cooking, and planning daily tasks. In this sense, the stove was a silent witness to survival, a central figure in the daily drama of life in rural Russia. The stove's enduring presence also shaped the psychological resilience of the inhabitants. Knowing that warmth, food, and comfort were always available created a sense of stability and hope. In a landscape defined by unpredictability and danger, the Pechka provided certainty. Its steady glow reassured families that, no matter how fierce the storm outside, life could continue inside. It became a symbol of human ingenuity, of the ability to create security and sustenance in the face of overwhelming natural forces. The Pechka's influence extended beyond the individual cabin to the community. Knowledge of stove construction, maintenance, and use was shared among neighbors, ensuring that each household could benefit from collective wisdom. This exchange reinforced social bonds and created a culture of mutual support, where survival depended not only on the physical structure of the cabin, but also on the knowledge, skills, and cooperation of the people. In this way, the stove was both a practical device and a cultural cornerstone, linking households and generations through shared experience and understanding. Even today, the legacy of the Pechka endures. In surviving examples of Izbas, the stove remains central, demonstrating the effectiveness of its design and the wisdom of the people who built it. Modern heating systems may have replaced it in many homes, but the principles it embodies, efficient use of fuel, centralization of warmth, multifunctionality, and resilience remain instructive. The Pechka is a reminder that survival in extreme conditions requires both material ingenuity and an understanding of the human-environment relationship. The stove was not merely an object, it was a force that shaped life itself. Its heat enabled sleep, cooking, cleaning, socialization, and preservation. Its presence dictated architectural design, interior arrangement, and daily routines. It was a physical anchor in a world dominated by winter's unpredictability, a psychological beacon that offered reassurance, continuity, and hope. Families relied on it not only for warmth but for life, creating a dynamic relationship between humans and the natural forces surrounding them. In understanding the Pechka, we gain insight into the genius of Russian rural life. The stove exemplifies the integration of practical engineering, ecological knowledge, cultural tradition, and social cohesion. Its design reflects centuries of observation, experimentation, and adaptation, resulting in a structure capable of sustaining life through months of isolation and sub-zero temperatures. The Pechka is more than a stove. It is the embodiment of survival, ingenuity, and the enduring human spirit in the face of one of the most challenging environments on Earth. Life in a Russian log cabin during the long, harsh winters was a delicate balance between necessity and adaptation, a rhythm dictated by the environment and the pressing demands of survival. The Izba was more than a shelter. It was a carefully orchestrated ecosystem where every object, space, and action contributed to the family's ability to endure months of freezing temperatures, snowstorms, and isolation. Outside, the world was a frozen expanse, dominated by wind and ice, but inside, life continued, shaped by routines, traditions, and the relentless ingenuity of those who called these cabins home. Every day was a carefully calibrated negotiation with the environment, a blend of labor, resource management, social interaction, and cultural practice, all revolving around warmth, sustenance, and preservation. From the first light of dawn, life in the cabin was a choreography of efficiency and adaptation. The family would awaken to the glow of the stove, whose masonry walls had retained heat from the previous evening. Even in the dead of winter, when outside temperatures were well below freezing, the Pechka provided a warm center, allowing the family to begin the day without immediate exposure to the icy air outside. Clothing was carefully layered to conserve warmth while allowing mobility for household tasks. Every garment had a purpose, from the thick woolen underlayers that trapped heat to mittens and felt boots designed to insulate against the cold floor. Preparation for the day was not merely about comfort, it was about survival, as exposure to frost or damp could quickly lead to illness. Breakfast was a ritual as much as a necessity. Food had been carefully stored and prepared in advance, preserved through drying, smoking, or salting. Porridge, bread, and soups were cooked over the stove, the steam rising in the cold cabin and filling the air with warmth and fragrance. Each meal was a carefully rationed portion, calculated to sustain energy for the demanding tasks ahead. The stove, once again, played a central role, both as a cooking apparatus and as a source of heat, its glow radiating life and stability throughout the home. Even in the harshest months, families found ways to make meals comforting, weaving together tradition, nutrition, and practicality into dishes that could nourish both body and spirit. Daily work was dictated by the necessities of survival, and the cabin itself influenced the division and pacing of labor. Chopping and storing firewood was an ongoing task, essential to maintaining warmth for cooking and sleeping. Firewood had to be dry and properly stacked to ensure efficient burning, and families often spent hours replenishing supplies, even when outdoor conditions were brutal. Similarly, food preparation was a continuous process. Preserved vegetables needed to be rehydrated, meat needed to be cooked carefully, and grains had to be measured precisely. Every task was shaped by the constraints of the environment, the limitations of the cabin, and the need to conserve resources. Efficiency was not a matter of convenience. It was a survival strategy honed over generations. The architecture of the Izba influenced daily life in profound ways. Small, compact spaces minimized heat loss, while multifunctional areas allowed for simultaneous cooking, socializing, and rest. Sleeping platforms were elevated to capture rising warmth from the stove. Benches doubled as seating and storage, and even the walls themselves served as shelves for food, tools, and household items. This clever use of space meant that every square foot of the cabin was utilized, and the flow of daily activity was carefully choreographed to maintain warmth and functionality. In this sense, the cabin was more than a home. It was an adaptive environment designed to optimize human activity under extreme conditions. Hygiene and personal care were also adapted to the winter environment. Water had to be melted from ice or snow, and bathing was limited, often restricted to brief periods to conserve heat. Clothes and bedding were dried near the stove to prevent dampness, which could lead to illness. Even cleaning the cabin required careful planning, as exposure to cold drafts could be dangerous. Families developed routines that balanced cleanliness with safety, using the warmth of the stove, the insulation of the cabin, and careful scheduling to maintain health and comfort. Every aspect of daily life was thus intertwined with the environment and the architectural features of the home, creating a system of living that was both practical and resilient. Children played and learned within these constraints, often observing and participating in survival tasks from a young age. They learned to chop small logs, feed the stove, and assist with food preparation, acquiring skills that would be essential for their future independence. Play was often imaginative and quiet, adapted to the small, warm spaces of the cabin. These activities were not merely recreational. They were educational, instilling knowledge of the natural world, resource management, and social cooperation. The cabin, in this sense, functioned as a classroom as well as a home, a space where cultural knowledge and survival skills were transmitted across generations. Social bonds were reinforced by the rhythms of cabin life. Families relied on one another not only for labor, but for emotional support. The long nights and extended isolation could be psychologically taxing, and the shared warmth of the stove, the shared meals, and the communal labor fostered cohesion and resilience. Storytelling, songs, and traditional games were common ways to pass time and maintain morale, reinforcing family identity and cultural continuity. Even small acts, such as mending clothes together or preparing meals, carried symbolic weight, reinforcing cooperation, patience, and mutual care. In these cabins, survival was inseparable from social structure, and the success of winter relied as much on emotional and cultural adaptation as on physical infrastructure. Venturing outside the cabin during winter was a calculated risk, governed by weather, urgency, and available protection. The frozen landscape was unforgiving, and exposure could be deadly. Families learned to read the signs of approaching storms, to navigate through deep snow, and to use sleds, skis, or paths across ice to move safely. Clothing, layered and insulated, was essential, but knowledge of the terrain and weather patterns was equally important. The cabin provided a secure base from which these excursions could be planned, a point of return where warmth, shelter, and sustenance were guaranteed. Every journey outside reinforced the value of the home and the systems of life it contained. Winter tasks extended beyond immediate survival to include maintenance and preparation for future months. Roofs, walls, and insulation had to be inspected and repaired as needed, and stored food and firewood had to be managed carefully. This ongoing labor required foresight, skill, and coordination, reflecting the constant negotiation between human activity and environmental pressure. Families learned to anticipate problems, to innovate solutions, and to adapt routines to shifting conditions, developing a level of environmental literacy and practical intelligence that was essential for life in the frozen north. Even leisure activities were adapted to the environment. When the weather outside made work impossible, indoor activities became central. Needlework, carving, storytelling, and music provided both entertainment and skill development. These pursuits were not distractions. They were ways to maintain psychological resilience, reinforce cultural knowledge, and strengthen family cohesion. The cabin provided a safe space for these activities, where the harshness of winter could be mitigated by warmth, light, and social interaction. In this way, adaptation was holistic, encompassing both physical survival and emotional well-being. The cultural significance of winter adaptations in the Izba extended beyond the household. Seasonal patterns, rituals, and festivals were aligned with the realities of winter life. Preparations for winter, including food storage, firewood collection, and cabin construction, were community events reinforcing social bonds and shared knowledge. Traditional practices, passed down through generations, reflected both practical experience and cultural values, embedding survival skills within a broader framework of identity, tradition, and meaning. The cabin, therefore, was both a physical structure and a cultural institution, shaping life, labor, and social cohesion in profound ways. Food preservation and resource management were particularly critical during the long months of winter. Families relied on stored grains, vegetables, and preserved meats to sustain them, and every portion had to be carefully rationed. The stove played a central role, maintaining warmth for storage areas, drying food, and cooking meals efficiently. Even minor miscalculations could have serious consequences, so careful planning, record keeping, and observation were essential. This careful management of resources was not merely a survival tactic. It was a reflection of an intimate understanding of the environment, the limitations of human labor, and the unpredictable nature of winter. Health and medicine were also adapted to the constraints of winter life. Limited access to fresh water, sunlight, and external assistance required families to develop home-based remedies and preventative measures. Warmth from the stove, proper insulation, and careful clothing choices were essential in preventing hypothermia and frostbite. Herbal remedies, dried foods, and traditional knowledge of healing were often employed to maintain health. In this context, the cabin functioned as a protective environment where both physical and social systems converged to mitigate the challenges of extreme cold. Even the smallest architectural and design decisions had profound implications for daily life. The orientation of the cabin, the placement of windows and doors, the thickness of walls, and the arrangement of internal spaces all influenced how effectively the household could manage heat, conserve resources, and coordinate labor. Families intuitively understood these relationships, and construction practices evolved to optimize comfort, efficiency, and safety. Every detail, from the stacking of logs to the positioning of sleeping platforms, reflected a practical response to the constraints of the environment. The social and emotional impact of winter adaptation cannot be overstated. In a world dominated by isolation, cold, and scarcity, the cabin became a sanctuary, a place of psychological as well as physical safety. Shared labor, communal meals, and collective problem-solving reinforced family cohesion, while traditions, stories, and rituals provided meaning and continuity. Children learned resilience and skill, while adults maintained vigilance and foresight. The cabin was a site of learning, protection, and cultural transmission, where the demands of survival were integrated with social, emotional, and cultural life. Even in extreme winter storms, when snow piled against walls and wind screamed through the forests, life continued inside the Izba. The stove radiated warmth, food was prepared, and family members engaged in necessary tasks, while maintaining morale through conversation, games, and music. The cabin was a dynamic environment, where survival was actively managed through labor, knowledge, and cooperation. It was both a refuge and a hub, sustaining life in a landscape that offered no mercy to the unprepared. In essence, daily life and winter adaptations in the Russian log cabin were a complex interplay of architecture, environment, labor, and culture. Families learned to harmonize with the rhythms of nature, using the cabin, the stove, clothing, routines, and communal knowledge to endure months of extreme cold. Every activity, from cooking and cleaning to play and storytelling, was adapted to optimize survival and maintain social cohesion. The Izba was not merely a home, it was an ecosystem, a learning space, a center of culture, and a sanctuary against the relentless power of winter. The story of the Russian log cabin, or Izba, is ultimately a story of survival, of families enduring some of the harshest winters on Earth, relying on ingenuity, community, and careful adaptation to persevere. The Izba was more than a shelter. It was a carefully constructed environment, a living system designed to protect life, conserve resources, and provide warmth and sustenance through months of relentless cold. It was the culmination of centuries of knowledge, passed down through generations, honed by trial and error, and perfected by observation of the natural world. Every log, every notch, every layer of moss or clay chinking reflected an intimate understanding of the forces at play outside. The frost that could freeze rivers, the wind that could drive snow into every crevice, the darkness that seemed endless in the long northern nights. Families relied on the Izba as a fortress against nature, a place where life could continue when the environment offered no concessions. Survival within the Izba required constant vigilance, careful planning, and coordinated effort. From the moment the first frost arrived in late autumn, families began a rhythm of preparation that would carry them through the winter months. Firewood had to be gathered, chopped, and stacked. Food had to be stored, dried, salted, or smoked to last for months. The cabin itself had to be inspected and maintained to ensure that it could withstand the weight of snow, the intrusion of wind, and the threat of moisture that could weaken the structure. This preparation was a complex choreography, integrating labor, observation, and foresight. It required both physical strength and mental discipline, and it demanded the participation of every family member, from children to elders. The stove, or Pechka, remained the heart of survival. Its centrality in the Izba extended far beyond the provision of warmth and the ability to cook. The stove was a hub around which daily life revolved, a constant presence that dictated the flow of activity and the organization of the interior space. Sleeping platforms were placed near its radiating heat, cooking occurred on its surfaces, clothing and bedding were dried and warmed against its masonry. Even social interactions were shaped by its presence, as families gathered close to share meals, tell stories, and maintain morale. The Pechka was not merely a physical object. It was a lifeline, a mediator between humans and the extreme environment outside. Its proper construction, maintenance, and use were critical to survival, and the knowledge required to manage it effectively was one of the most valuable forms of wisdom passed down through generations. The architectural and material design of the Izba was a testament to resilience. Thick logs interlocked at carefully notched corners created walls capable of resisting the penetration of wind and cold. Moss, clay, and straw filled every gap, insulating the interior and preventing drafts. Roofs were steeply pitched to shed snow and protect the structure from collapse. Windows and doors were deliberately small and tightly sealed, minimizing heat loss. Every element was calculated to create a controlled environment that could sustain life even when temperatures fell well below freezing. The cabin itself became a living participant in survival, a structure that required attention, respect, and understanding. Daily life within the Izba was equally adaptive. Routines were meticulously organized to conserve heat, manage resources, and ensure that essential tasks could be performed efficiently. Meals were carefully prepared and rationed, firewood was replenished methodically, clothing and bedding were layered and adjusted to maintain warmth without impeding mobility. Children learned early how to contribute to the household, observing adults and participating in labor that was essential for the family's well-being. Even play and leisure activities were adapted to the constraints of space and temperature, fostering both learning and psychological resilience. Life in the Izba was not easy, but it was structured, purposeful, and deeply connected to the environment. The social dimension of survival cannot be overstated. Families relied on one another not only for labor but for emotional support, sharing the burdens and rewards of winter life. Storytelling, music, and oral traditions helped maintain morale, transmit knowledge, and reinforce social bonds. The Izba functioned as both a physical and cultural shelter, protecting inhabitants from environmental dangers while also nurturing identity, memory, and continuity. The winter months, though isolating and challenging, became a time of intense familial and social cohesion, where survival depended as much on cooperation and shared knowledge as on physical infrastructure. Resilience in these conditions was both practical and psychological. The long, dark winters were mentally taxing, and the potential for despair was real. Yet the structure of the cabin, the warmth of the stove, the routines of daily life, and the presence of family all contributed to a sense of stability and hope. The Izba provided a controlled environment in which humans could maintain agency despite the uncontrollable forces outside. Survival was thus an interplay of preparation, adaptation, and endurance, a continuous negotiation with the harsh realities of nature. Resource management was another cornerstone of survival. Food had to be preserved with care, rationed judiciously, and stored safely to prevent spoilage. The stove and its residual heat were used to dry herbs, vegetables, and meats, extending their usability. Firewood consumption was monitored to ensure that supply would last the entire season. Water had to be obtained from ice or snow, carefully melted and managed to avoid waste. These tasks required foresight, discipline, and intimate knowledge of the environment. Mistakes could be fatal, and the ability to plan, anticipate, and respond effectively was a defining characteristic of resilient families. Adaptation extended to clothing, sleeping arrangements, and hygiene. Layering was essential. Clothing had to retain heat while allowing movement for labor. Sleeping platforms were elevated to benefit from the rising warmth of the stove, and bedding was designed to insulate